The wooden platform creaked beneath Sara Daniels' bare feet as the auctioneer's gavel struck 3 times, each blow echoing through the frozen January air like a death knell that made her shiver harder than the bitter wind already cutting through her threadbare dress. It was 1882 in Elko, Nevada, and the morning sun did nothing to warm the brutal cold that settled over the town like a curse, turning every breath into white vapor and every exposed inch of skin into burning pain that felt somehow worse than numbness. Sara's wrists ached from the iron shackles that bound them, the metal so cold it felt like it was melting into her bones, and her auburn hair whipped around her face in tangled strands as she stood on the auction block in the center of town, surrounded by men whose eyes held varying degrees of interest, cruelty, and indifference. She had been sold to pay her stepfather's gambling debts, dragged from the small boarding house where she had worked as a cook for the past 3 years after her mother died, and now she stood here like livestock while men shouted numbers that represented what they thought her life was worth. The auctioneer, a fat man with a silver pocket watch and breath that smelled of whiskey even at 9 in the morning, grabbed her arm and yanked her forward so the crowd could get a better look. Sara stumbled but caught herself, refusing to fall, refusing to give these men the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken, even though inside she felt like she was shattering into 1,000 pieces that would never fit back together again. $20, someone called from the back. 25, another voice countered. Sara's teeth chattered so hard she bit her tongue, tasting copper blood warm against the cold that made her whole body ache. She was 22 years old and had never imagined her life would come to this, standing on a platform in the freezing cold being sold like a horse or a piece of furniture to whoever had enough money and saw enough value in owning another human being. The law said this was illegal, that you could not sell people anymore, but out here in Nevada, the law was whatever the richest men said it was, and her stepfather had connections with the sheriff who looked the other way when money changed hands in the right direction. $30, a new voice called out, deeper than the others, and Sara's eyes found the man who spoke, even though she had been trying not to look at any of them directly. He stood at the edge of the crowd, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair that fell past his collar, and a face that might have been handsome if it were not set in such stern lines. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat and leather gloves, a black hat pulled low against the wind, and something in his gray eyes made her breath catch in her throat for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. 35, the previous bidder countered, a man Sara recognized as Dutch Henderson, who owned a saloon 2 streets over and had a reputation for treating his girls rough enough that 2 of them had disappeared last year and nobody asked questions. The tall man's jaw tightened. $50. A murmur went through the crowd because $50 was serious money, more than most men in Elko made in 2 months of hard work, and Dutch Henderson scowled but did not counter the bid. The auctioneer waited, his greedy eyes scanning the crowd for anyone willing to go higher. But the crowd had gone quiet, everyone watching the tall man with a mixture of respect and curiosity. $50 going once, the auctioneer called. $50 going twice. He raised his gavel. Sold to Lucas Preston for $50. The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to seal Sara's fate, and her knees went weak, but she locked them, determined not to collapse even though black spots danced at the edges of her vision. Lucas Preston moved through the crowd with long strides, pulling a leather pouch from inside his coat and counting out gold coins that glinted in the pale sunlight. The auctioneer took the money with greedy fingers, biting each coin to test its authenticity before nodding his satisfaction. "She's all yours," the auctioneer said, gesturing to Sara like she was a purchase to be collected. "Good luck with this one. Got some spirit in her, I reckon." Lucas did not respond to the auctioneer. Instead, he climbed the 3 steps to the platform and stood in front of Sara, looking at her with those steady gray eyes that gave away nothing of what he was thinking or what he planned to do with her. Up close, she could see he was younger than she had first thought, probably only about 26 or 27, with a strong jaw shadowed with dark stubble and a small scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He reached out slowly, giving her time to see what he was doing, and unlocked the shackles around her wrists with a key the auctioneer had handed him, along with some papers that supposedly made her his legal property. The moment the iron fell away, Sara gasped, rubbing her raw wrists where the metal had chafed the skin bloody, and fresh pain shot through her arms as blood rushed back into her hands. She swayed on her feet, and Lucas caught her elbow, his grip firm but not painful, steadying her until she found her balance again. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly, his voice a low rumble that somehow cut through the wind and the noise of the dispersing crowd. Sara nodded because she did not trust her voice not to break, and also because she had no choice but to walk wherever this man wanted her to go because he owned her now, had paid $50 for the privilege of doing whatever he wanted with her life. The thought made her stomach twist with fear and anger, and a deep exhaustion that went beyond the physical cold seeping into her bones. Lucas shrugged out of his sheepskin coat, and before Sara could process what he was doing, he draped it around her shoulders. The heavy warmth of it was so sudden and unexpected that tears sprang to her eyes, the first tears she had allowed herself since being dragged to the auction block 2 hours ago. The coat smelled like leather and wood smoke, and something clean she could not name, and it was still warm from his body heat, wrapping around her like a shield against the brutal cold that had been slowly killing her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking on the words. Lucas just nodded once, then he turned and started walking toward a horse tied to the hitching post in front of the general store. Sara followed because what else could she do, clutching the coat around herself and trying to ignore the eyes of the townspeople watching her leave with her new owner. She kept her chin up and her back straight, even though shame burned hot in her chest, mixing with the fear and the cold and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this man would not be as bad as Dutch Henderson would have been. The horse was a big bay gelding, with kind eyes and a white star on his forehead, and he huffed out a warm breath that steamed in the cold air as Lucas checked the saddle. Then Lucas turned to Sara, and before she could ask what he wanted her to do, he bent and scooped her up into his arms like she weighed nothing at all. Sara gasped and instinctively grabbed onto his shoulders, her fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt as he lifted her easily and settled her sideways across the saddle. "You are barefoot and half frozen," he said, his voice matter of fact. "You will not make it 2 steps in this cold." He was right, Sara knew, even though being held in his arms made her heart pound with a confusing mixture of fear and something else she did not want to examine. He swung up into the saddle behind her with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle, then wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her secure against his chest. With his free hand, he gathered the reins and urged the horse into a walk, heading out of town toward the north, where the land opened up into rolling hills covered in sagebrush and scattered juniper trees. Sara sat stiffly in his arms at first, hyper-aware of every point where their bodies touched, but as they rode and the cold wind kept cutting through even the warmth of his coat, she found herself leaning back against his solid chest without quite meaning to. He was warm, radiating heat like a furnace, and her body instinctively sought that warmth even as her mind told her to be careful, to stay alert, to remember that this man owned her now, and she had no idea what he would demand in return for that $50 he had spent. They rode in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes, the landscape unchanging around them, just endless stretches of brown earth and gray-green sagebrush, with mountains rising blue and distant on the horizon. Sara's feet had gone completely numb, past pain into a terrifying nothing that made her worry about frostbite, and her whole body shook with shivers she could not control no matter how hard she tried. "Not much farther," Lucas said, his voice rumbling through his chest into her back. "Another 10 minutes. Sara nodded, not trusting herself to speak around the chattering of her teeth. True to his word, 10 minutes later, a ranch house came into view, nestled in a small valley with a barn and several outbuildings clustered around it. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line, promising warmth and shelter, and Sara felt a surge of desperate relief so strong it made her dizzy. Lucas rode right up to the front porch and dismounted with that same easy grace, then reached up and lifted Sara down from the saddle. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched the ground because she could not feel them at all, and Lucas caught her. Then without hesitation he bent and scooped her back into his arms, cradling her against his chest as he carried her up the porch steps and through the front door into the blessed warmth of his home. The heat inside hit Sara like a physical force after the hours in the freezing cold, and she gasped, her whole body convulsing with shivers that were somehow worse now that she was warm. Lucas carried her straight to the fireplace, where a good fire burned hot and bright, and he set her down gently in a large leather chair pulled close to the hearth. Then he grabbed a thick quilt from the back of a sofa and wrapped it around her over his coat, tucking it in around her sides. "Stay here," he said, and then he was gone, his boots heavy on the wooden floor as he moved deeper into the house. Sara sat in the chair, shaking so hard her teeth rattled, staring into the fire and trying to process everything that had happened. She was in a stranger's house, owned by a man she did not know, with no idea what he expected from her or what her life was about to become. The fear she had been holding back started to rise up her throat like bile, threatening to choke her, but before panic could fully take hold, Lucas returned carrying an armful of items. He knelt in front of her chair, setting down a basin of warm water, some clean cloths, and a jar of what looked like salve. Then he gently pulled the quilt back and reached for her feet, his movements careful and deliberate. "No," Sara said, jerking her feet back. "I can do it myself." Lucas looked up at her, his gray eyes meeting hers steadily. "Your feet are frostbitten. If we do not warm them properly, you could lose toes. I have dealt with frostbite before. Have you?" Sara shook her head mutely, and after a moment she let her feet relax, giving him permission to touch her, even though every instinct screamed at her to be cautious, to protect herself. Lucas took one of her feet in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses she could feel on his palms, and he began to carefully massage warmth back into her frozen flesh, starting at her ankle and working down. The pain as feeling returned was excruciating, 1,000 needles stabbing into her skin all at once, and Sara bit down hard on her lower lip to keep from crying out. Lucas saw her distress and his expression softened slightly. "I know it hurts," he said quietly. "But the pain means there is still feeling, which means we caught it in time. Talk to me. Tell me something about yourself. It will help distract you." "What do you want to know?" Sara asked through gritted teeth. "Your name, for starters. The papers just said you were Sara Daniels, age 22, no family." "That is all there is to know," Sara said bitterly. "My mother died 3 years ago. My stepfather gambled away every cent we had, and then some. And when he could not pay his debts, he sold me to cover what he owed." Lucas's hands paused for just a moment on her foot, his jaw tightening. Then he continued the massage, dipping a cloth in the warm water and wrapping it around her toes. "Your stepfather is a coward and worse. No man worthy of the name would do such a thing." "And yet here I am," Sara said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "Sold at auction like a horse, bought by you for $50. What exactly do you expect from me, Mr. Preston? What did you pay that money for?" Lucas looked up at her again, holding her gaze, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I expect nothing from you that you do not freely give. I bought you because Dutch Henderson was bidding, and I know what he does to women in his employ. I bought you because you looked like you were about to freeze to death on that platform and nobody else seemed to care. I bought you because it was the right thing to do." Sara stared at him, wanting desperately to believe him, but afraid to let herself hope. "Nothing is free, Mr. Preston. Everyone wants something." "Lucas," he corrected, "and you are right that I want something, but maybe not what you think. I want help running this ranch. I want someone who can cook and clean and help with the books, because I am terrible at keeping records. I want company because this house gets lonely with just me rattling around in it. In return, I can offer you a roof over your head, food in your belly, safety, and wages if you want to save money to eventually leave and start your own life somewhere else." "Wages," Sara repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. "But you own me." "No," Lucas said firmly, moving to her other foot and beginning the same gentle massage. "I have papers that say I bought you, but I do not believe any man can own another person. You are free to leave whenever you want, though I would ask that you wait until spring when the weather is not trying to kill you. And if you choose to stay and work for me, you deserve to be paid for your labor like anyone else would be." Tears spilled down Sara's cheeks before she could stop them, hot and fast, because his words were everything she had not dared to hope for, and she did not know if she could trust them, but God, she wanted to. She wanted to believe that this stern-faced cowboy with the gentle hands and the steady eyes was exactly what he seemed to be. A decent man in a world that had shown her precious little decency. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Lucas was quiet for a long moment, focusing on wrapping her other foot in a warm cloth. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. 5 years ago, my sister was in a situation similar to yours. She was trapped in a bad marriage to a man who hurt her, and she had no way out because the law said a man could do what he wanted with his wife. I was working on a ranch in Colorado and did not know how bad things had gotten until I came home to visit and found her with a broken arm and bruises all over. I took her away from there that night, brought her here where her husband could not find her. She lived with me for 2 years before she met a good man, a blacksmith in Elko, and married him properly. She is happy now, safe, and I swore that if I ever had the chance to help another woman in trouble, I would not hesitate. Sara absorbed this information, seeing Lucas in a new light, understanding now the fierce protectiveness she had sensed in him, even through her fear and cold. Where is your sister now? She and her husband moved to California 6 months ago. He got an opportunity to open his own shop in Sacramento. I get letters from her every few weeks. She's doing well, happy, expecting her first child in the spring. You must miss her, Sara said softly. I do, Lucas admitted. This house has been too quiet without her, but I am glad she found her happiness. He finished wrapping Sara's feet and sat back on his heels, studying her with those steady gray eyes. Your feet should be fine. The color is coming back, and I do not see any blackening that would indicate serious damage. But you need to keep them elevated and warm for the next few days. I cannot just sit idle for days, Sara protested. If I am to work for you, I should start earning my keep. You can start earning your keep by not arguing with me about resting until your body recovers from nearly freezing to death, Lucas said, but there was a hint of amusement in his voice that took the sting from the words. Besides, you need to build your strength back up. I can tell from looking at you that you have not been eating nearly enough for too long. He was right, Sara knew. Her stepfather had cut her food rations when he started having financial trouble, and the past 2 weeks had been especially lean. She was too thin, her dress hanging loose on a frame that had once been pleasantly curved, and she felt weak in a way that went beyond the cold and exhaustion. I will make you something to eat, Lucas said, standing up in one smooth motion. There is a bedroom down the hall, second door on the right. It was my sister's room. You can sleep there. But first, food and something hot to drink. He disappeared into what Sara assumed was the kitchen, and she sat in the chair by the fire, wrapped in the quilt and his coat, trying to process the surreal turn her life had taken. This morning, she had been on an auction block, certain she was being sold into a nightmare. Now she was sitting in a warm house, her feet carefully tended, being offered wages and freedom by a man who seemed too good to be true. Lucas returned carrying a tray laden with a bowl of stew that smelled like heaven, fresh bread with butter, and a large mug of coffee. He set it on a small table beside her chair, and Sara's stomach growled so loudly it was embarrassing. She picked up the spoon with shaking hands and took a bite of the stew, and the flavors exploded on her tongue, rich beef and vegetables and a thick gravy that was better than anything she had tasted in months. This is wonderful, she said, taking another bite, trying not to shovel the food into her mouth even though she wanted to. Did you make this? Yesterday, Lucas said, settling into a chair across from her. I am a passable cook, but nothing fancy. If you really can cook well, it will be a blessing to have decent meals again. They fell into a comfortable silence as Sara ate, and she was acutely aware of Lucas watching her, though his gaze did not feel invasive or threatening. He seemed content to just sit and rest, and she realized he must have been up early to ride into town for the auction, then dealt with all the stress of bidding and riding back in the cold. He had to be tired too, but he had taken care of her first, making sure she was warm and fed before seeing to his own needs. When she finished eating, the exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes felt heavy and her whole body ached with a bone-deep weariness that made it hard to think straight. Lucas must have seen it in her face because he stood and came over to her chair. Come on, he said gently. Let me show you to your room. You need to sleep. Sara let him help her up, and when her feet could not quite hold her weight, he once again swept her into his arms and carried her down the hallway. The second door on the right opened into a small but pleasant room with a large bed covered in a thick quilt, a dresser with a mirror, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the ranch yard. Lucas set her down on the bed carefully, then pulled the quilt up over her. I will find you some proper clothes, he said. My sister left some things behind that should fit you well enough until we can get you to town for your own. For now, just rest. Sleep as long as you need. I will be around if you need anything. Lucas, Sara said as he turned to leave. He paused in the doorway, looking back at her. Thank you for everything, for saving me. His expression softened, and he gave her a small nod. "Get some sleep, Sara. Things will look better after you have rested." He closed the door quietly behind him, and Sara lay in the soft bed, wrapped in warmth and safety, and let herself cry for the first time in years. She cried for everything she had lost, for the mother who had died too young, for the stepfather who had betrayed her, for the fear and cold and humiliation of the auction. But she also cried with relief, with the tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, her life had taken a turn towards something better. She fell asleep with tears still wet on her cheeks, and did not wake until the next morning, when pale winter sunlight streamed through the window, and the smell of coffee and bacon drifted down the hallway, calling her back to consciousness with the promise of a new beginning. Sara woke slowly, confused at first by the softness of the bed beneath her, and the warmth surrounding her like a cocoon. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and panic flared hot in her chest as memories of the auction flooded back. Then she remembered Lucas, his steady gray eyes and gentle hands, the way he had carried her into his home and tended her frostbitten feet and asked nothing in return. She lay still, listening to the sounds of the house, and heard movement in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes and the low hum of someone singing off-key. Slowly, Sara pushed back the quilt and sat up, testing her feet. They were sore and tender, but not the excruciating pain of last night. And when she looked at them, she saw the color was good, pink and healthy, with no signs of blackening or blisters. Lucas had saved her feet, possibly saved her life, and she owed him a debt she did not know how to repay. She noticed a stack of clothes folded neatly on the dresser that had not been there last night, and she stood carefully, wobbling slightly as she made her way over to examine them. There were 2 dresses, both simple but well-made calico in dark colors that would not show dirt easily, along with undergarments, wool stockings, and a pair of sturdy leather boots that looked to be about her size. Sara's throat tightened with emotion as she realized Lucas must have brought these in while she slept, quietly laying them out so she would have proper clothes when she woke. She washed her face and hands in the basin on the washstand, then dressed in one of the dresses, a deep burgundy that fit surprisingly well through the bodice, though it was a bit long in the hem. The boots were slightly too large, but the wool stockings helped fill the space, and after months of going without proper footwear, it felt like luxury to have her feet protected and warm. Sara braided her hair as best she could without a brush, twisting the long auburn strands into a simple plait that hung down her back. Then she made the bed carefully, smoothing out every wrinkle in an old habit from her years of working at the boarding house. Finally, she took a deep breath and opened the bedroom door, stepping out into the hallway and following the smell of coffee toward the kitchen. Lucas stood at the stove, his back to her, flipping bacon in a large cast-iron skillet. He had changed into a fresh shirt, dark blue flannel that stretched across his broad shoulders, and his dark hair was damp like he had recently washed. The kitchen was large and well organized, with a big wooden table that could seat 6, open shelves lined with dishes and supplies, and windows on 2 walls that let in plenty of morning light. "Good morning," Sara said softly, not wanting to startle him. Lucas turned, and his face broke into a smile that transformed his usually stern features, making him look younger and infinitely more approachable. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Sara admitted. "Thank you for the clothes. They fit wonderfully." "I am glad. Those were my sister's. She would be happy to know they are being put to good use." He gestured to the table. "Sit down. Breakfast is almost ready." "Let me help," Sara said, moving toward the stove. "If I am to work for you, I should start now. And honestly, I need to do something useful. I cannot just sit idle after everything you have done for me." Lucas studied her for a moment, then nodded and stepped aside. "All right. There are eggs in the basket by the door, fresh this morning from the hen house. And there is bread in the box if you want to slice some for toasting." Sara got to work with practiced efficiency, cracking eggs into a bowl and whisking them smooth, while Lucas finished with the bacon and moved it to a platter. They worked together in an easy rhythm that surprised Sara with how natural it felt, as if they had been doing this for years instead of hours. She scrambled the eggs with butter and a pinch of salt, toasted thick slices of bread, and helped Lucas carry everything to the table. They sat across from each other, and for a few minutes they just ate in silence. But it was not an uncomfortable silence. Sara was acutely aware of Lucas, the way he moved with deliberate purpose, the steadiness in his hands as he buttered his toast, the occasional glance he sent her way, as if checking to make sure she was really there and really all right. "Tell me about the ranch," Sara said finally, needing to break the silence before her thoughts spiraled into dangerous territory. "How long have you been here? Is it just you working the land?" "I bought this place 4 years ago," Lucas said, leaning back in his chair with his coffee. "It is not a huge spread, just 200 acres, but it is good land with a creek that runs year-round. I run about 100 head of cattle, mostly for beef, and I have a dozen horses that I breed and train. I do most of the work myself, but I hire on a few hands during branding and roundup season. There is a man named Charlie who helps out regularly, an older fellow who has been ranching all his life. He lives in town, but comes out 3 days a week to help with the heavy work." "It sounds like a good life," Sara said, meaning it. "Peaceful." "It can be," Lucas agreed, "though it is hard work too, especially in the winter when the animals need constant care and the weather is brutal. But I would rather be out here working for myself than working for someone else and never quite feeling like I am building something that matters." Sara understood that sentiment deeply. She had spent years working for other people, first helping her mother with laundry and mending, then cooking at the boarding house. And she had never felt like any of it was truly hers. Everything could be taken away at a moment's notice, as she had learned so painfully when her stepfather sold her to pay his debts. "What would you like me to do today?" Sara asked. "I mean, besides cooking, what needs to be done around here?" Lucas seemed to consider this. "Honestly, the house could use a good deep cleaning. My sister kept it neat, but I have let things slide over the past few months. And if you are up for it, I have a ledger that is a complete disaster. I cannot keep the numbers straight to save my life. If you have any skill with bookkeeping, it would be a huge help." "I can do both," Sara said, feeling a spark of purpose ignite in her chest. "I kept the books at the boarding house for 2 years. The owner said I had a head for numbers." "Then you are already earning your keep," Lucas said, with that small smile that did something strange to Sara's pulse. "But take it easy today. Your body has been through a lot. If you get tired, rest. That is an order." Sara found herself smiling back despite everything. "Are you always this bossy?" "Only when people are stubborn enough to need it," Lucas replied, and there was a teasing warmth in his voice that made Sara's chest tighten, with an emotion she was not ready to name. They finished breakfast and Sara insisted on washing the dishes while Lucas headed out to tend the animals. She stood at the kitchen window, watching him walk across the yard toward the barn, his long stride confident and purposeful. And she found herself wondering about this man, who had saved her without asking for anything in return. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way, but it was more than his looks that drew her attention. It was the quiet competence in everything he did, the gentleness in his hands when he had tended her frostbitten feet, the way he spoke to her like she was a person who mattered rather than the property he had purchased. Sara shook herself and focused on the dishes, scrubbing each plate and cup until it gleamed, then drying them and putting them away on the shelves. She explored the house slowly, taking inventory of what needed to be done. The main room had a thick layer of dust on every surface. The floor needed sweeping and mopping, the windows were grimy, and the bedrooms all needed fresh linens. It was a lot of work, but Sara felt energized by the prospect of making this house clean and welcoming, of having something tangible to show for her efforts. She started with the main room, sweeping out the dust and old ashes from around the fireplace, then working her way across the floor until she had a large pile of dirt and debris to sweep out the front door. She found a bucket and filled it with water heated on the stove, added soap, and got down on her hands and knees to scrub the wooden floorboards until they shone. The physical work felt good, using her muscles and focusing her mind on the task at hand, rather than on the uncertainty of her future. She was standing on a chair wiping down the high shelves when Lucas came back inside, stomping snow off his boots on the porch before entering. He stopped in the doorway and looked around, surprise clear on his face. "Sara, I said to take it easy. You did not need to do all this today." "I wanted to," Sara said, climbing down from the chair. "It feels good to work, to be useful. And honestly, staying busy keeps me from thinking too much." Lucas nodded slowly, understanding in his gray eyes. "I know that feeling. Work can be a good medicine for a troubled mind." He looked around the room again, taking in the clean floors and dust-free surfaces. "The place looks better than it has in months, thank you." "It is my job," Sara said, but she felt pleased by his praise nonetheless. "What do you want for lunch? I can make something if you tell me what supplies you have." There is salt pork and potatoes in the cellar, canned vegetables in the pantry, and flour and such for biscuits or cornbread. Make whatever sounds good to you. I trust your judgment." Sara nodded and headed to the kitchen to start preparing the meal, while Lucas sat down at the table with a stack of papers and began sorting through them with a furrowed brow. She glanced at him occasionally as she worked, noting the concentration on his face and the way he muttered numbers under his breath. He really did seem to struggle with the bookkeeping, and Sara found herself looking forward to helping him make sense of it all. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Sara would wake early and make breakfast, then spend the morning cleaning and organizing, while Lucas worked with the animals and did repairs around the ranch. They would eat lunch together, usually taking time to talk about the work that needed doing, or just small, inconsequential things that helped them learn about each other. In the afternoons, Sara would tackle the ledgers, painstakingly going through receipts and bills and recording everything in neat columns that actually made sense. Lucas would come in from his work cold and tired, and Sara would have hot coffee ready and dinner cooking, filling the house with warm smells that made it feel like a real home. At night, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in companionable silence. Lucas told her stories about growing up in Kansas before his family moved west, about learning to break horses from an old vaquero who had more patience than any man he had ever met, about his sister and how proud he was of the life she had built. Sara shared smaller pieces of her own history, talking about her mother, who had been kind but worn down by a hard life, about learning to cook from a French woman who had worked at the boarding house and had taught Sara all her secrets. They did not talk about the auction or the fact that Lucas technically owned papers that said Sara was his property. They did not talk about what would happen when spring came, and Sara would theoretically be free to leave if she wanted. They just existed in the present, day by day, building something that felt fragile and precious, something Sara was afraid to examine too closely for fear it would disappear like morning mist. 3 weeks passed in this way, and Sara felt herself healing in ways that went beyond her physical recovery. She put on weight from eating regular meals, her cheeks filling out and her body regaining its curves. Her hands, which had been chapped and rough, became softer with the help of a salve Lucas made from beeswax and herbs. She laughed more, smiled more, felt the tight knot of fear in her chest slowly loosening its grip. And she found herself watching Lucas with growing frequency, noticing things about him that had nothing to do with gratitude for what he had done for her. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, really smiled, not just the small, polite quirk of his lips. She noticed how he was always gentle with the animals, speaking to them in a low, soothing voice that made even the most skittish horse calm down. She noticed the strength in his hands, but also the care, the way he could rope a calf for branding, but also carefully splint the broken leg of a barn cat that had gotten injured. She noticed, and she tried very hard not to let herself feel anything beyond gratitude and friendship, because the alternative was too complicated and too dangerous to consider. The 4th week brought a massive snowstorm that dumped 2 feet of fresh powder overnight and made it impossible to do anything but stay inside and keep the fire burning. Lucas had to dig a path from the house to the barn just to tend the animals, and he came back inside covered in snow and shivering despite his heavy coat. "Get those wet things off before you freeze," Sara scolded, already moving to the fire to add more wood and build up the heat. "I will make hot coffee and get blankets." Lucas obeyed, stripping off his coat and boots and the flannel shirt that had gotten soaked through. He stood by the fire in just his undershirt and pants, and Sara tried very hard not to notice the way the thin fabric clung to his muscled chest and arms. She thrust a quilt at him and busied herself with the coffee, her cheeks burning for reasons that had nothing to do with the heat from the fire. "Thank you," Lucas said, wrapping the quilt around his shoulders and sinking into his chair with a grateful sigh. "I think we are in for a few days of being snowed in. I brought in extra wood yesterday and made sure the animals have plenty of feed and water, so we should be fine." "A few days stuck inside," Sara mused, bringing him a mug of steaming coffee. "Whatever will we do to pass the time?" Lucas looked up at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. His gray eyes were intense, holding hers with a weight that felt significant. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lucas cleared his throat and looked away, and the moment broke. "I am sure we will find something," he said lightly. "You can teach me how to actually keep the ledgers organized so I do not make such a mess of them in the future." Sara nodded, relieved and disappointed in equal measure, and settled into her own chair with her own mug of coffee. Outside, the wind howled and the snow kept falling, but inside the ranch house it was warm and safe, and Sara realized with a jolt that she was happy. Actually, genuinely happy in a way she had not been since before her mother died. The realization terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. They spent the storm-bound days playing cards, reading books from Lucas's small collection, cooking elaborate meals because they had the time and the ingredients, and talking about everything and nothing. Lucas taught Sara how to play poker, and she surprised him by winning 3 hands out of 5, prompting him to accuse her of counting cards. Sara taught Lucas how to make proper French pastries, and they laughed until their sides ached when his first attempt at croissants came out looking like lumpy rocks. On the 3rd night of the storm, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Lucas suddenly spoke into the comfortable silence. "Sara, can I ask you something personal?" Sara looked up from the sock she was darning, one of many that needed mending. "Of course. Do you ever think about what you want to do with your life? I mean, beyond working here. Do you have dreams, plans, things you have always wanted to do?" Sara set down the sock and thought about the question seriously. "I used to dream of having my own restaurant. Nothing fancy, but a place where people could come for good, honest food and friendly conversation. My mother and I used to talk about it sometimes, how we would save up money and open a little place somewhere nice. But after she died, that dream seemed impossible. I was just trying to survive day to day." "It does not have to be impossible," Lucas said quietly. "If you stay here and work for me, I will pay you fair wages. In a few years, you could save enough to make a start. And if you wanted to open a place in Elko, I would help however I could. I know people in town who would support a good restaurant." Sara felt tears prick her eyes at his words, at the casual way he talked about her future, as if it was a given, as if she was worth investing in. "Why are you so kind to me, Lucas? Really, you saved my life, you have given me a home, you treat me like I matter. Why?" Lucas was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire, his strong profile lit by the flickering flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because you do matter, Sara. You matter to me." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes intense. "I know we have not known each other long, and I know the circumstances of how we met were terrible, but these past few weeks have been the best I have had in years. You have made this house feel like a home again. You have made me laugh and think and look forward to coming inside at the end of the day. And if I am being honest, which I think I should be, I find myself caring about you in a way that goes beyond just wanting to help someone in need." Sara's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Lucas, I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything," Lucas said quickly. "I am not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know that you are not just an employee or a charity case. You are important to me, and whatever happens, wherever life takes you, I want you to know that." Sara stood up from her chair and crossed the small space between them, kneeling in front of Lucas's chair so they were eye to eye. She reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and warmth of his palm against hers. "You are important to me too," she said softly. "More important than I probably should admit. When I was on that auction block, I thought my life was over, that I would be sold to someone cruel, and that would be the end of any hope I had for happiness. But you saved me, Lucas. You saved me, and you have been nothing but kind and respectful and wonderful. I care about you. I care about you so much it scares me." Lucas's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized had fallen. "You do not have to be scared. I would never hurt you, Sara. I would never take advantage or push you into something you do not want." "I know," Sara whispered. "That is why I am not scared of you. I am scared of how much I want this, want you, want a future that actually means something." Lucas leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was tender and sweet and full of promise. Sara kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and it felt like coming home in a way she had never experienced before. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said quietly. "Not as an employee. Stay with me, Sara. Let me court you properly. Let us see where this could go." "Yes," Sara said without hesitation. "Yes, I will stay. I want to see where this goes, too." Lucas smiled, that full, genuine smile that transformed his face, and kissed her again, And outside the storm raged, but inside they were safe and warm and falling in love in the way that changes everything. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, and Lucas had to dig his way out to check on the cattle and horses, making sure none had gotten hurt or trapped in the deep snow. Sara watched from the window, bundled in a blanket, her lips still tingling from the kisses they had shared the night before. Everything had changed, and yet nothing had changed. They still worked together with easy efficiency, still talked and laughed and shared meals. But now there was an added layer of awareness, of anticipation, of possibility that made every glance and accidental touch feel charged with meaning. When Lucas came back inside, red-cheeked from the cold but grinning, Sara had hot stew ready and fresh bread still warm from the oven. They ate together at the kitchen table, their knees touching underneath, and talked about plans for the ranch once the weather improved. "I need to ride into town next week," Lucas said. "We are running low on supplies, and I need to pick up some feed from the mill. Would you like to come with me? You could see about getting some fabric to make new dresses if you want, and I know the general store has a good selection of books." Sara hesitated, the memory of her last time in Elko still raw and painful. "Will people stare? Will they know that you bought me at auction?" Lucas reached across the table and took her hand. "Some people will know, yes, but anyone who treats you with disrespect will answer to me. You are under my protection, Sara, and I will make sure everyone understands that." Sara squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his certainty. "All right, I would like to go. It would be good to see the town properly, not as a piece of property being sold, but as a person choosing to be there." The week passed quickly, each day bringing them closer as they navigated this new dynamic between them. Lucas was true to his word about courting her properly. He brought her wildflowers he found preserved under the snow, their dried petals still holding a hint of color. He played his harmonica after dinner, clumsy but earnest, making her laugh with his terrible rendition of popular songs. He talked to her about his hopes for expanding the ranch, about maybe getting into breeding horses more seriously. And he listened when she talked about her dreams of a restaurant, taking her ideas seriously and offering suggestions that showed he really cared about what she wanted. They kissed often, sweet stolen moments by the fire or in the kitchen. But Lucas never pushed for more, always respectful of the boundaries Sara had not explicitly set, but that he seemed to understand instinctively. Sara appreciated his patience, but she also felt desire building inside her, a wanting that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the man Lucas was, the way he made her feel safe and valued and desired in return. The day they rode into Elko was bright and clear, the sun reflecting off the snow so intensely it hurt to look at it directly. Sara rode beside Lucas on a gentle mare named Daisy, and she felt nervous but also determined to face the town that had witnessed her humiliation. Lucas had dressed in his best clothes, a dark suit jacket over a clean white shirt, and he had given Sara money from his own pocket, pressing it into her hand with instructions to buy whatever she needed or wanted without worrying about the cost. Elko was busier than Sara remembered, the main street full of people going about their business, horses and wagons kicking up slush that had turned the snow gray and muddy. Lucas helped Sara down from her horse and tied both animals to the hitching post in front of the general store. Then he offered her his arm like a true gentleman. Sara took it, holding her head high as they walked into the store together. The proprietor, a balding man named Mr. Jameson, looked up from his counter and his eyes widened slightly when he saw Sara. She tensed, waiting for judgment or scorn, but Mr. Jameson simply nodded politely. "Good morning, Lucas, Miss Daniels. What can I help you folks with today?" "We need supplies," Lucas said easily, his tone making it clear that Sara was to be treated with respect. "The usual staples, plus some fabric if you have anything nice in stock. And my friend here would like to look at your books." Mr. Jameson nodded and gestured to the far wall, where bolts of fabric were displayed. "Just got a new shipment last week. Some real pretty calicos, and even some silk if you are interested. Books are on the shelf by the window. Take your time." Sara relaxed slightly, realizing that Mr. Jameson was choosing to treat her as a normal customer, and she was grateful for his discretion. She spent a pleasant hour looking through fabric, selecting material for 3 new dresses and a warm shawl, while Lucas ordered supplies and arranged for them to be delivered to the ranch. She also found 2 books that looked interesting, novels by authors she had never read, and Lucas bought them for her without hesitation. As they were leaving the store, packages in hand, they nearly ran into a woman on the sidewalk. Sara looked up and recognized Mrs. Catherine Hart, who ran the boarding house where Sara had worked. Mrs. Hart was a severe woman in her 50s, always dressed in black, and Sara had never seen her smile in the 3 years she had worked for her. "Sara Daniels," Mrs. Hart said, her voice cold. "I heard what happened to you. Shameful business being sold like that. And now, here you are, dressed up nice and shopping with the man who bought you. I suppose you have made yourself comfortable in your new situation." Sara felt heat rise in her cheeks, the old shame and anger threatening to choke her. But before she could respond, Lucas stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Sara in a protective gesture that was unmistakable. "Mrs. Hart," Lucas said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I do not believe anyone asked for your opinion on Miss Daniels' situation. She works for me as my housekeeper and bookkeeper, respectable employment that she performs with skill and dignity. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you keep it to yourself, unless you want everyone in town to know that you would prefer a young woman had been sold to Dutch Henderson instead. I wonder how that would reflect on your Christian charity." Mrs. Hart's face went red, then white, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Finally, she sniffed and swept past them without another word, her skirts rustling with indignation. Sara stared after her, then looked up at Lucas, who was still tense with anger. "Thank you," Sara said softly, "for defending me." Lucas looked down at her, his expression softening. "Always. You do not deserve to be treated that way by anyone." They finished their errands and headed home, riding side by side through the snowy landscape, and Sara felt something settle inside her chest. She had faced the town that had seen her lowest moment, and she had survived it, stronger for having Lucas at her side. She could do this. She could build a life here, with him, and let the past stay in the past, where it belonged. That night, after dinner was cleared away and they were sitting by the fire, Sara made a decision. She stood from her chair and went to Lucas, settling herself in his lap, in a way that made his eyes widen with surprise and something darker, more heated. "Sara," he said, his voice rough, "what are you doing?" "What I want to do," Sara said, cupping his face in her hands. "What I have wanted to do for days now. Lucas, I do not want to wait anymore. I do not want to be cautious or slow or patient. Life is too short and too uncertain. I want you. I want this. If you want me too." Lucas's hands came to her waist, gripping tight enough that she could feel the tremor in his fingers. "I want you more than I have ever wanted anything. But Sara, I need you to be sure. I need to know this is what you really want, not something you think you owe me or something you feel obligated to give." "I am sure," Sara said firmly. And then she kissed him with all the passion and longing she had been holding back, and Lucas kissed her back with equal fervor, his hands sliding up her back to tangle in her hair. They made love that night in front of the fire, slow and tender and full of whispered promises. And afterward they lay tangled together in the quilts, Sara's head on Lucas's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," Lucas said into the darkness, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it is too soon and too complicated, but I do. I love you, Sara Daniels." Sara tilted her head up to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his gray eyes, the fear that she might not feel the same. "I love you too," she said clearly. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you wrapped your coat around me on that auction platform. You saved me, Lucas. In every way a person can be saved, and I choose you every day for as long as you will have me." Lucas kissed her again, deep and thorough, and they made love a second time, less tender and more urgent, a celebration of everything they had found in each other against all odds. The winter gradually gave way to early spring, the snow melting into rushing streams and the first green shoots pushing up through the muddy ground. Sara and Lucas worked together to prepare the ranch for the busy season ahead, and their love deepened with each passing day. Lucas taught Sara to ride properly, not just the gentle plodding she had done on Daisy, but real riding, controlling a horse with confidence and skill. Sara taught Lucas to cook more than just basic stew and beans, showing him how to make delicate sauces and perfectly flaky pie crusts that made him groan with pleasure. They talked late into the night about their future, making plans that stretched out years ahead. Lucas wanted to marry Sara properly, in the church in Elko, with witnesses and a celebration, but he wanted to wait until enough time had passed that nobody could accuse Sara of marrying him out of obligation or fear. Sara understood his reasoning, but she chafed at the waiting, wanting the world to know she had chosen Lucas freely, that what they had was real and based on love, not on the circumstances that had brought them together. Charlie, the older ranch hand Lucas had mentioned, came back to work when the weather improved, and he took to Sara immediately, treating her with the respect of a beloved niece. He was a weathered man in his 60s with a white beard and kind eyes, and he had been ranching since before Lucas was born. He told Sara stories about the old days while they worked together in the garden she had planted behind the house, teaching her which vegetables grew best in Nevada's climate and how to protect tender plants from late frosts. "Lucas is a good man," Charlie told her one afternoon, as they weeded between rows of lettuce. "I have known him since he bought this place, and he has always been fair and honest, works harder than any man I ever met. But these past few months, since you came here, he is different, happy in a way I never seen before. You are good for him, Miss Sara, real good." "He is good for me too," Sara said, meaning it with her whole heart. "I never thought I could be this happy, Charlie. After everything that happened, I thought happiness was something that happened to other people, not to me." "Sometimes the worst things lead us to the best things," Charlie said wisely. "The trick is being brave enough to recognize it and hold on tight when it comes your way." Sara thought about those words often in the weeks that followed. She had been through something terrible, something that would have broken many people, but it had led her here, to this ranch and this man and this life that felt more real and right than anything she had known before. She held on tight, just as Charlie had said, pouring her love into every meal she cooked, every ledger entry she recorded, every kiss she shared with Lucas in the quiet moments they stole throughout the busy days. In early May, Lucas rode into town and came back with a small box that he presented to Sara after dinner. Inside was a ring, simple gold, with a small diamond that caught the lamplight and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. "A Sara Daniels," Lucas said, dropping to one knee in front of her chair, in a gesture so traditional and romantic it made her throat tighten with emotion. "I know we have not been together long by conventional standards, and I know the circumstances of how we met were complicated, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this. I love you with everything I am. You have made my house a home, and my life something worth celebrating. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Sara said, tears streaming down her face as she pulled him up and kissed him fiercely. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes. I love you, Lucas Preston. I want to be your wife and build a life with you and grow old together on this ranch." Lucas slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, catching the light as Sara held up her hand to admire it. They decided to marry in June, giving them time to plan a small ceremony and for Lucas's sister to travel from California to attend. Sara wrote letters to a few friends from her boarding house days, women who had been kind to her, inviting them to witness her happiness. The wedding took place on a beautiful June morning in the small church in Elko. Sara wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs that Lucas had insisted on buying from the most expensive shop in town. Her hair was swept up in an elegant arrangement, held with pins that had belonged to Lucas's mother, a precious heirloom he had given her with trembling hands and tears in his eyes. Lucas wore his best suit, dark and perfectly fitted, looking more handsome than Sara had ever seen him. His sister Emma was there with her husband Thomas, both of them beaming with joy for Lucas's happiness. Charlie stood as Lucas's best man, and one of Sara's friends from the boarding house, a young woman named Martha, stood up with Sara. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas kissed Sara with such tender passion that several people in the congregation sighed with romance. Afterward, there was a celebration at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard, laden with food that Sara and Emma had spent 2 days preparing. People from town came, more than Sara had expected, and she realized that Lucas was well respected in the community, that people genuinely liked him and were happy to see him settled with a wife. Even Mr. Jameson from the general store came, bringing a beautiful set of china as a wedding gift. "For when you opened that restaurant you told me you were dreaming about," he said with a wink. "Lucas mentioned it, and I think Elko could use a proper eating establishment run by someone who knows what they are doing." Sara was touched beyond words, and she squeezed Lucas's hand, grateful for the way he supported her dreams, and talked about them to others as if they were already reality rather than just distant hopes. The celebration lasted long into the evening, with music and dancing and laughter that echoed across the ranch. Lucas waltzed with Sara under the stars, holding her close and whispering words of love into her ear that made her blush and laugh and fall even more deeply in love with this man who had saved her in every way that mattered. When the guests finally left and the newly married couple retired to their bedroom, Lucas carried Sara over the threshold of their home with a grin that made him look boyish and happy. They made love as husband and wife for the first time, and it was different than before, deeper somehow, weighted with the promises they had made before God and witnesses. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Sara tracing patterns on Lucas's chest while he played with her hair, both of them savoring the perfect peace of the moment. "I never thought I could have this," Sara whispered into the darkness. "A real marriage, a real home, a real future. When I was standing on that auction block, freezing and terrified, I thought my life was over, but it was actually just beginning. We both got a new beginning that day," Lucas said, kissing the top of her head. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Sara. I promise to spend the rest of my life proving that to you every single day." "You already have," Sara said, tilting her face up to kiss him. "You already have." The years that followed were full and rich with the kind of happiness that comes from hard work and deep love. Sara and Lucas built their life together day by day, facing challenges and celebrating triumphs as partners in every sense of the word. The ranch prospered under their joint management, the cattle multiplying and the horses gaining a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far away as California and Montana. Sara kept her books meticulously, turning Lucas's chaotic ledgers into organized records that allowed them to track expenses and profits with precision. She also began saving money toward her restaurant dream, carefully setting aside a portion of the earnings Lucas insisted she was entitled to as a full partner in the ranch, rather than just a wife. Lucas supported this completely, never once suggesting she should abandon her ambitions to focus solely on being a rancher's wife. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Sara discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy tempered by nervousness, neither of them having much experience with babies, but both eager to become parents. Sara's pregnancy was relatively easy, and Lucas was endlessly patient with her moods and cravings, riding into town at odd hours to buy pickles or candy, or whatever she suddenly decided she absolutely had to have. Their son was born in December of 1883 during a snowstorm that reminded Sara of the blizzard that had trapped them together in the early days of their relationship. The labor was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from Elko, who stayed at the ranch for 3 days to make sure both mother and baby were healthy. Lucas paced outside the bedroom door, driving Charlie half crazy with his anxiety, until finally the midwife opened the door and told him he had a healthy son. Lucas burst into the room to find Sara exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. The baby had dark hair like Lucas and gray eyes that would eventually turn hazel, and when Lucas took his son in his arms for the first time, tears streamed down his face unchecked. "He is perfect," Lucas whispered, staring down at the tiny face with wonder. "Sara, he is absolutely perfect." They named him James, after Lucas's father, who had passed away years before, and the boy became the center of their world. Lucas was a devoted father, involved in every aspect of James's care, despite the ranch work that kept him busy from dawn to dusk. He would come in from the fields covered in dust and sweat, wash up, and immediately reach for his son, holding James against his chest and talking to him in a low, soothing voice about horses and cattle and everything he would teach the boy as he grew. Sara watched them together and fell even more deeply in love with her husband, seeing the tenderness in his rough hands as he changed diapers and the patience in his face as he walked the floor with a colicky baby at 2 a.m. Lucas was everything she could have asked for in a partner and father, and she thanked God regularly for the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. When James was 2 years old, Sara became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth after Sara's mother. Elizabeth was easier than James had been, a calm baby who slept through the night almost from the beginning and smiled at everyone who looked at her. Lucas doted on his daughter with the special tenderness fathers have for their girls, and watching him braid her fine blonde hair when she was old enough to sit still for it made Sara's heart swell with love and contentment. The children grew healthy and happy on the ranch, learning to ride almost before they could walk, helping with age-appropriate chores, and absorbing the values of hard work and integrity that Lucas and Sara modeled every day. James showed an early aptitude for working with horses, just like his father, while Elizabeth was fascinated by cooking and often stood on a stool beside Sara in the kitchen, learning to knead bread dough and measure ingredients for pies. When James was 5 and Elizabeth was 3, Sara finally felt ready to pursue her restaurant dream in earnest. She had saved a substantial amount of money, and Lucas had been scouting locations in Elko, looking for a building that would suit her purposes. They found a place on Main Street, a former dress shop that had been vacant for 2 years, with large front windows and a kitchen in back that would need some work but had good bones. Lucas bought the building outright, refusing to let Sara use her savings for the purchase, insisting that her money should go toward equipment and supplies and making the place exactly what she envisioned. They spent 6 months renovating, working together on weekends, while Charlie watched the children, painting walls and building tables, and installing a new stove that was the most modern thing Sara had ever seen. Sara's restaurant opened in the spring of 1889 to a line of customers that stretched down the street. Word had spread about Sara's cooking through the friends and neighbors who had tasted her food at various gatherings, and people were eager to try her menu of hearty ranch fare made with French techniques she had learned years ago. The restaurant was an immediate success, so popular that Sara had to hire 2 women from town to help with the serving and washing up. Lucas was immensely proud of Sara, boasting to anyone who would listen about his wife's business acumen and culinary skill. He often brought the children into town for lunch at the restaurant, and Sara would take a break from the kitchen to sit with them, basking in the sight of her family together in the space she had created through determination and hard work. The restaurant thrived, becoming a fixture of Elko that drew visitors from neighboring towns and even occasional travelers passing through on their way to California. Sara's dream had become reality in a way that exceeded even her most optimistic hopes, and she knew it was only possible because of the foundation of love and support Lucas had given her from the very beginning. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lucas surprised Sara with a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation since they had married. Charlie and Emma agreed to watch the children and the restaurant for a week, and Lucas and Sara took the train west, holding hands like newlyweds as they watched the landscape roll by outside the windows. San Francisco was amazing, a bustling city full of people and noise and excitement that was both thrilling and overwhelming after years of ranch life. They stayed in a fancy hotel with indoor plumbing and electric lights, ate at restaurants that served exotic foods Sara had only read about, and walked along the waterfront watching ships come and go from distant ports. One evening, as they stood on a pier watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of orange and pink, Lucas pulled Sara close and kissed her temple. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "Really, truly happy?" Sara looked up at him, this man who had bought her at an auction in the freezing cold and carried her to his warm ranch house, who had given her safety and love and the freedom to become everything she was meant to be. "I am happier than I ever dreamed possible," she said honestly. "My life with you has exceeded every hope I ever had. The ranch, the restaurant, our children, everything we have built together. It is more than I could have imagined standing on that auction block 10 years ago." "I am glad," Lucas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Because you saved me too, Sara. I was just existing before you came into my life, going through the motions but never really living. You taught me what it means to build something real, something that matters. You gave me a family and a purpose beyond just surviving. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." Sara kissed him as the sun sank below the horizon, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would love this man for the rest of her life, through whatever joys and sorrows the future might bring. They returned home to Elko renewed and energized, ready to face whatever came next together. The children had grown noticeably in just the week they had been gone. James now tall enough to help his father with real ranch work, and Elizabeth reading books that were far advanced for her age. Sara threw herself back into the restaurant with fresh enthusiasm, introducing new dishes she had learned about in San Francisco, and experimenting with flavors that delighted her regular customers. Lucas expanded the ranch, buying an additional 100 acres from a neighbor who was retiring, and began breeding horses more seriously, focusing on sturdy ranch horses that could work cattle all day without tiring. His reputation grew, and soon he was selling horses to ranchers throughout Nevada and even into California and Oregon, carefully matching each horse to its new owner's needs with a care that spoke of his integrity and expertise. 3 more children came in the following years, 2 more sons named Daniel and Robert, and another daughter they named Grace. The ranch house had to be expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Lucas and Charlie building on additional bedrooms and a larger kitchen that could handle cooking for so many people. The house was always full of noise and laughter and the organized chaos of a large family, and Sara thrived in the center of it all, managing the household and the restaurant with the same efficiency she had once used to keep the boarding house running smoothly. As the children grew, they each found their place in the family enterprises. James took over more and more of the ranch work, showing the same patient skill with horses that his father had. Elizabeth began helping at the restaurant, learning the business side as well as the cooking, and it became clear she would eventually take over when Sara was ready to step back. Daniel showed an aptitude for numbers and became Sara's bookkeeper for both the ranch and the restaurant, keeping meticulous records that would have made his mother proud even when he was only 12 years old. Robert, the quietest of the children, loved the land itself and spent hours studying the soil and water, figuring out ways to make the ranch more productive through better irrigation and crop rotation. And Grace, the baby, was like her father in temperament, steady and patient, with a fierce protective streak for anything she loved. The years passed in a blur of seasons, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. There were hard times, like the winter of 1893, when a blizzard killed 20 head of cattle and nearly destroyed the barn, requiring months of work and expense to rebuild. There was the summer drought of 1895 that threatened the restaurant's supply chain and required creative solutions to keep the menu full and interesting. There was the bout of influenza that swept through Elko in 1897 and left James bedridden for 3 weeks, with Sara nursing him day and night in terror that she might lose her firstborn. But for every hard time, there were a dozen good ones. There were Christmas mornings with all 5 children gathered around the tree, ripping into presents with squeals of delight. There were summer evenings on the porch. The whole family gathered to watch the sunset and tell stories while fireflies danced in the growing darkness. There were harvest celebrations and birthday parties and the quiet everyday moments of a family that genuinely loved being together. Sara and Lucas grew older together, silver threading through their hair and lines appearing around their eyes and mouths, marks of years spent laughing and loving and living fully. But they never lost the spark that had ignited between them on that frozen January day when Lucas had wrapped his coat around Sara's shoulders and carried her to safety. If anything, their love deepened with time, becoming the bedrock foundation upon which their entire family was built. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the children organized a huge celebration at the ranch, inviting everyone who had been part of Sara and Lucas's life over the years. The yard was packed with people, tables groaning under the weight of food that had been prepared by Sara's restaurant staff, and a small band played music while couples danced on a platform James had built specially for the occasion. Emma came from California with her husband and their 3 children, now nearly grown, and Charlie was there, of course, older and slower, but still sharp as ever, telling stories about the early days of the ranch to anyone who would listen. Friends from town, ranch hands who had worked for Lucas over the years, regular customers from the restaurant, all gathered to celebrate the love story that had become legend in Elko. As the sun set and lanterns were lit all around the yard, Lucas stood and called for everyone's attention. Sara, sitting beside him at the head table, looked up in surprise because they had not planned any speeches. "I just want to say a few words," Lucas said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. 25 years ago, I went to an auction in town and made the best investment of my life. I paid $50 for the privilege of meeting the woman who would become my wife, my partner, my best friend, and the mother of my children. Sara, you have given me everything that matters in this world. You have made me a better man than I ever would have been without you. You have filled my life with joy and purpose and a love so deep, it takes my breath away. I thank God every day for the circumstances that brought you to me, even though they were terrible, because they led to this life we have built together. I love you today, and I will love you tomorrow, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." Sara was crying openly by the time he finished, and when Lucas bent to kiss her, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. She held on to him tightly, this man who had saved her in every way that mattered, and whispered against his lips, I love you too, always and forever." The celebration continued long into the night, and when everyone finally went home and the children had helped clean up and retreated to their own rooms, Sara and Lucas walked hand in hand out to the pasture behind the house, where they could see the stars spread across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Do you ever think about that day?" Sara asked quietly. "The auction, how scared I was, how uncertain everything felt." "Sometimes," Lucas admitted, "but mostly I think about everything that came after. All the good years, the children, the life we have built. That day was just the beginning of our story, not the whole story." "It is a good story," Sara said, leaning against his solid warmth. "Better than I ever could have written if I had been in charge of how things turned out." "It is not over yet," Lucas said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on top of her head. "We still have years ahead of us, Sara. Years to watch our children grow and start their own families. Years to run the ranch and the restaurant. Years to just be together and enjoy the life we have worked so hard to create." "I cannot wait," Sara said, meaning it with her whole heart. And they stood there together under the stars, this couple who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful and lasting, grateful for the past and excited for the future, still as deeply in love as they had been the first time Lucas had kissed her in front of the fire all those years ago. The years continued to pass, bringing all the changes that time inevitably brings. James married a girl from town named Anna, a quiet young woman with a gift for sewing, who made the most beautiful quilts Sara had ever seen. They built a house on the far end of the ranch property and started having children of their own, making Sara and Lucas grandparents and filling them with a joy they had not known existed until they held their first grandchild in their arms. Elizabeth took over the restaurant when Sara decided to step back at age 50, keeping everything that made it special while adding her own touches that brought in a new generation of customers. She married the town doctor, a kind man named William, who had moved to Elko from Boston and fallen in love with both Elizabeth and the small-town charm of Nevada. They had twin girls who were the light of everyone's lives, precocious and funny and smart as whips. Daniel went to San Francisco to study business and came back with innovative ideas for expanding the family's enterprises, helping Lucas establish a horse breeding program that became known throughout the West. He married late, at 30, to a widow with 2 children who he loved as his own, blending families in a way that spoke of his generous heart. Robert got his wish to work the land, turning sections of the ranch into productive farms that supplied vegetables to Sara's restaurant and several others in town, proving that careful management of resources could make even Nevada's harsh climate produce abundance. He married his childhood sweetheart, a girl who had grown up on a neighboring ranch, and they raised 4 sons who would eventually take over the farming operations. And Grace, the baby, surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, opening a small school on the ranch property that served the children of the ranch families and nearby homesteaders. She married a rancher's son from Wyoming, who came to buy horses from Lucas and ended up staying for Grace. They split their time between the 2 states, eventually settling in Nevada permanently when Grace's school grew too large to leave. Sara and Lucas watched it all with pride and wonder, marveling at how their love had multiplied into this vast network of family that stretched across generations and geography. They spent their later years working less and enjoying more, taking long rides together across the ranch land they knew so well, hosting Sunday dinners where the whole extended family gathered and the house rang with the voices of children and grandchildren. Lucas's hair turned completely white, and his hands developed arthritis that made some ranch work difficult, but he never complained, adjusting to his limitations with the same practical acceptance he brought to everything in life. Sara developed a slight limp from a fall on ice one winter, but it barely slowed her down, and she still insisted on baking pies for the restaurant twice a week because her crusts were still the flakiest anyone had ever tasted. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the family threw another big celebration, this one even larger than the 25th, because there were so many more family members to include. Watching Lucas surrounded by their children and grandchildren, his face lit with laughter, as one of the grandsons told a story about trying to break a particularly stubborn horse, Sara felt her heart overflow with gratitude for the life they had built together. That night, lying in bed in the darkness, Lucas's hand finding hers like it had thousands of times over 40 years, Sara whispered into the quiet, Thank you for saving me, Lucas. Not just that day on the auction block, but every day since. Thank you for showing me what love looks like, what family means, what a life well lived can be. Lucas squeezed her hand, his voice thick with emotion. You saved me just as much, Sara, maybe more. I was half a person before you came into my life. You completed me in ways I did not even know I needed. Everything good in my life traces back to you. They lay together in the darkness, still holding hands, still in love after 40 years and 5 children and more challenges and triumphs than they could count. And if Sara sometimes thought about that frozen January morning when she had stood on an auction block, terrified and hopeless, she thought about it with gratitude for the journey that started there, because it had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Lucas Preston died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1915 at the age of 69. With Sara beside him, holding his hand just as she had held it on countless nights throughout their life together. He went quietly, without pain, slipping from sleep into death so gently that Sara did not realize he was gone until she woke to find him still and cold beside her. The grief nearly destroyed her, this loss of the man who had been her anchor and her love for more than 3 decades. But her children and grandchildren surrounded her with support, and she drew strength from the legacy Lucas had left behind in the thriving ranch, in the children who embodied his values, in the love that still filled every corner of the life they had built together. Sara lived another 8 years, remaining sharp and active until the very end. She spent her days surrounded by family, still cooking occasionally, still riding out to her favorite spots on the ranch, still telling stories about Lucas to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive through words and laughter, and the deep love that had never faded even in death. She died in the summer of 1923, at the age of 73, in the same bedroom where she had spent so many nights in Lucas's arms. Her children were with her, holding her hands and telling her it was okay to let go, that Lucas was waiting for her on the other side. And Sara smiled as she took her last breath, because she knew it was true, that Lucas was there waiting to carry her home one more time, just as he had carried her from the freezing cold into the warmth all those years ago. They buried Sara next to Lucas in the small cemetery on the ranch, under an oak tree they had planted together 30 years before. The headstone was simple, reading Lucas Preston, beloved husband and father, and Sara Daniels Preston, beloved wife and mother, with their years of birth and death, and underneath, a single line that James had suggested and everyone had agreed was perfect. Their love was a shelter from every storm. The ranch continued through the generations, passed down to James and then to his children and his children's children, each generation adding their own chapter to the story, while honoring the foundation that Lucas and Sara had built. The restaurant in Elko remained in family hands for over 100 years, a landmark where locals and tourists alike could eat good food and hear stories about the remarkable woman who had founded it, and the cowboy who had saved her from an auction block on a freezing January morning in 1882. Because that is how love stories work sometimes. They start in the most unlikely places, with the most difficult circumstances, and they grow into something that transcends the individuals involved, becoming a legacy that touches countless lives across generations. Sara and Lucas's love had started with an act of rescue and grown into an epic that defined a family, a ranch, a restaurant, and a corner of Nevada that would remember their names long after everyone who had known them personally was gone. Their story became legend, told and retold, embellished and remembered, a testament to the power of compassion and courage and the choice to see possibility in darkness. And while the details might have changed slightly with each retelling, the heart of the story remained true. A woman standing in freezing cold, terrified and alone, and a man who stepped forward and changed both their lives forever with a simple act of mercy that bloomed into a love that would last beyond death and into eternity.